Okay, for today, we're going to be talking about social engineering, a topic very near and dear to my heart. I know this event can be very technical, which is fantastic, but we can't forget that the bad guys will also focus on the human side. And quite often, this is where they are the most effective. So for this morning, I'm very excited to talk about social engineering. So, what exactly is social engineering, and really, what is the problem? Well, when it comes to this concept of social engineering, let's take a look, step back, and see how we've traditionally approached cybersecurity. If you think about it, traditionally, we have approached it primarily from a technical perspective. So, for example, if we look at the Windows operating system, 20 years ago, it was really, really easy to hack into. The average life expectancy of a Windows computer was about 3 hours. I know this because of my research with the HoneyNet project. Microsoft felt a tremendous amount of pain. And over a 20-year period, they did a lot to secure the Windows operating system. As a result, if I deploy default operating system, Windows operating system on the internet today, it takes months, if not years, before it's hacked into. That is, until the human touches the keyboard. When people interact with technology, that is when we have risk. Now, why is that? Well, if you look at what we've done for the human operating system, that's right. You and I are another operating system. In the past 20 years, we've actually done very little to secure people. In fact, I would argue that we have become so good at using technology to secure technology that we are driving the bad guys to target people. So, in part, that is why bad guys use social engineering. We've become so good at securing technology, we're giving them no choice to target the human. Now, you'll notice in this diagram, I have 2004 circled. For those of us who've been in cybersecurity for a while, that was a really big deal. That's when firewalls were turned on by default in the Windows operating system. And ever since then, I've started seeing the bad guys more and more actively target people. Think about it. Most worms that we know of happened at 2004 or before because that's when firewalls did not really exist. After 2004, bad guys have started targeting humans more and more. So what ends up happening is, if you look at the very same diagram, human-based attacks or social engineering attacks have only increased as we have gotten better at using technology to secure technology. This is why I like to say the key element when it comes to people are not the weakest link. That implies that we are blaming people. People are now the primary attack vector. So, what we have to understand is, if people are the primary attack vector, what's the primary way that they're targeting us? And that would be social engineering. That is the primary way bad guys are targeting us today. So, what ends up happening is, what is social engineering? That is what this talk is all about today. I want to give you a good understanding of the fundamentals of social engineering and how the bad guys are getting better at it and what the latest trends are. Now, instead of me boring you to death with what social engineering is, I'd like to go ahead and show you a quick 2-minute video of one of my favorite examples of social engineering. So, for the conference hosts, Folks, you should have the URL, or should I share the URL on my side for this? Do you want me to go and share the URL, or do you have it all set to share? Oh, looks like they've got it.
Hi, I'd like to return these.
Oh, of course. Do you have your receipt?
No, but they're unopened. They haven't been touched.
I really need your receipt.
They are sealed. They are brand new.
Oh, do you have the credit card that you used?
This is ridiculous. I bought these last week.
Ma'am, you can try client services on the 6th
You
floor.
know, never mind. I'll just keep them. Jesus. Can I at least get a bag?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm checking out of room 2814, Gary Randall.
Did you have a pleasant stay?
Terrific.
Okay, my name is Monica. Is there anything else I can do for you or arrange transportation?
I think we're all set.
Hi, this is Mrs. Randall. We just checked out of room 2814. May I speak with Monica, please?
This is she.
Hi, Monica.
Hi.
Hi. We just found out our flight was canceled.
Oh, no.
I know, I know. And instead of staying at some horrible airport hotel, we were hoping that maybe we could get our original room back.
Yeah, we can give you that same room back.
That would be amazing. Thank you so much. We're just gonna go grab a bite. Would it be possible to get the maid in there now?
Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. We really appreciate it.
It's not a problem.
Thank you so much. We'll see you soon. Hi. I'm so sorry. Can you finish up later? I just have to get off my feet.
Of course.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
All right, folks, if you're not familiar, that was the opening scene from a movie called Ocean's 8. And if you think about it, Ocean's 8, Ocean's 11, those series of movies and many, many others are really all about social engineering. And this is how some of our most advanced attacks today happen. If you think about it, Twitter, the recent Twitter hack that we all saw happen live was nothing more than a phone call, just like you saw here in that. So this is a very real attack we need to be concerned about. So what I want to do is share a little bit more about how these attacks work and what we in the security community can do to learn more about that. By the way, this is the link to that YouTube video you just saw, but also there's an example of a couple other videos if you want to see also. So what is social engineering? Remember, it's not a technical attack. It's a psychological attack. Sometimes we get so caught up in technology. And I was a geek for many years in cybersecurity, so I totally understand. But we forget just how easy these attacks can be. The bad guys are taking advantage of vulnerabilities in the human operating system. We people are really bad at estimating risk. We overestimate risk for things that are highly visual, and we overestimate risk for things we're not in control of. Think about it. The reason why this is the case is we were programmed to estimate risk on the plains of Africa 100,000 years ago when our ancestors were worried about things like lions and tigers. Fast forward to 21st century cyberspace, and those risks have radically changed. Let me give you an example. If I were to tell you that you and your family were going to go swimming in the ocean, say you're going on a vacation and you're going to go, say, somewhere, let's say, just go swimming in the ocean. The number one thing people are afraid of when swimming in the ocean is sharks. Now, I get it. We may not have these guys in the Baltic Sea, but in many of the oceans around the world, people are worried about sharks. But if you think about it, we're overestimating the risk. Very few people die by sharks every year, maybe 5, 10 people around the world. And yet, thousands of people die every day to mosquitoes. Mosquitoes are far more likely to kill you at the ocean than sharks. Mosquitoes kill more people every day than a shark does in 100 years. The reason why this is important is people underestimate risk when they're using technology. They feel like they're in control. So they underestimate the risk. They don't see the impact. Getting your limbs torn off by a shark, very visual. I overestimate the risk. Technology getting hacked is very silent and invisible. Combine this with how easy it is for any bad guy anywhere in the world to pretend to be anything they want and target anyone they want. We have the perfect storm for hacking the human. And this is precisely what bad guys are doing. Social engineering quite often is nothing more than bad guys playing on our emotional triggers. Quite often, it's creating a sense of fear, urgency, or crisis, or quite often a curiosity or something too good to be true. If this is something you're interested in, a classic book by Dr. Robert Cialdini called Influence is all about how people use emotion to influence what they want to do. Quite often, books like this are not only popular with pen testers, books like this are quite popular with salespeople. Salespeople use these techniques to influence to buy their products. Just social engineering is more about bad guys using these to trick or fool us into doing what they want us to do. So I mentioned one of them, a sense of curiosity or too good to be true. Here's a relatively simple phishing email that's using this technique. You receive a random phishing email saying your signature is required for a contract. And you're like, well, what contract? I did not know I needed a contract. What's this about? And they get you to click on it. And quite often, once you click on the link, as you know, you could be taken to a malicious website, a website to log into and harvest your information, all sorts of different things. But also, bad guys use a sense of urgency or crisis to rush you into making a mistake. Based on all the different attacks I've seen in my years of experience, this is probably the number one most common emotional trigger bad guys are using to fool or trick people. So the idea that bad guys are taking a crisis and using it is not new. So, for example, this is from the Microsoft Digital Defense Report. So, by the way, folks, for years, Microsoft put out what's called the Security Intelligence Report. Starting of fall of this year, they've ended it and they now call it their Digital Defense Report. Just came out last month. In it, they had a section on phishing attacks based on all the data they're collecting around the world. And it's a lot of data. And no surprise, in March, when COVID first came out, there was a huge spike in COVID-related phishing attacks because COVID was and still is on the news. But during the sense of March, there was an incredible sense of urgency, crisis, and fear about COVID. So what ends up happening is the bad guys use that to get everybody's attention for their attacks. So was the concept of COVID phishing emails new? Yes. Was the concept of bad guys using recent events for their phishing attacks new? No. The bad guys have been doing this for years. So, for example, here in the United States, we have both the elections coming up and massive forest fires going on in the West Coast. Two recent highly visual urgent scenarios that the bad guys are currently leveraging. So, emotion is one of the primary ways bad guys are using social engineering. Why are they doing it? Because it works. So I work with a lot of different extremely talented folks in forensics, in penetration testing, and in cyber threat intelligence. In fact, right before this talk, I talked to Katie Nichols, one of the world's cyber threat intelligence experts. She is one of the founders of the MITRE attack model used for cyber threat intelligence. And I asked her, what's new? What are you seeing and why? And she said, one of the key things, social engineering, not because it's fancy, not because it's cool, but because it consistently works for the bad guys, what we call return on investment in the business world. Bad guys don't get extra credit for using an exploit never seen before. They're going to come in the easiest way possible that reliably works. And what they tend to find is not only is that social engineering, but primarily email and phone-based social engineering attacks. Yes, you can do social engineering attacks in person, like we just saw in the video. Yes, you can do social engineering attacks like something called a USB drop, where you take a USB drive, drop it in the parking lot of an office, and hope somebody picks it up and inserts it into their computers. However, bad guys are going to go with the easiest, most effective way possible. And primarily that's either email or phone. Email we've seen for years. It's easy for bad guys to craft, scale, and automate. In other words, they can send out thousands, they can send out a few targeted. The bad guys are getting even better now. And I'll get this into a little bit, but when bad guys hack into organizations, they may not do whatever they want right away. Quite often, they'll start accessing executive emails, tracking the email conversations, and then hijacking those conversations, pretending they're a part of it, and then getting what they want. We'll give an example of this in a moment. Don't forget phone-based attacks. It was interesting. 10, 15 years ago, I saw email as the primary method of social engineering. So 20, 25 years ago, phone was the primary way. So it was phone a lot, email just starting to become popular. Then as organizations adopted email, bad guys used email for social engineering, phishing attacks. But I'm seeing a bit of the opposite in the past couple of years. Bad guys are starting to use phone more and more often. Why? We're getting better at filtering email-based phishing attacks. We're getting better at training people on them, and it's harder to use technology to block or stop phone-based attacks. Also, bad guys can call people's personal mobile number, which we really can't block. The other thing, as we saw in the example, is it's far easier to create motion in a phone call, such as a sense of urgency or something along that creating trust. So phone call attacks, while taking a little bit more work, can be far more effective and harder to block. So we're seeing all sorts of phone call attacks, both automated basic ones and targeted ones. So when it comes to social engineering, these are the two primary modalities we're going to see. Now, we're going to geek out a little bit. Based on all my experience in the past couple of years, I tend to categorize social engineering attacks in three buckets. Basic level one, which is typical, and I'm going to give examples of each. Generic, basic, opportunistic. Think, you know, the Nigerian prince scams. Level 2 is when the bad guys do some customization. In other words, they know what organization you may work for, they know your name, and they've kind of taken a template and cut and paste that information. Level 3 is fully targeted. So what happened is 10, 15 years ago, almost all phishing emails were very opportunistic, level 1. Then over the years, they started customizing a little bit. Nowadays, we see level 3, fully targeted. Instead of sending lots of emails, you send them to 1 or 2. Now, level 1 and level 2 are still happening. For you and me, it may seem like noise in the background, but they're working. So bad guys are going to continue to do level 1 and level 2, but it's primarily opportunistic cyber criminals. Level 3, and I'm going to give examples, level 3 is what I would consider nation state or more sophisticated cyber criminals who have more advanced TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures. So level 1, this is an example of what I would consider as a level 1. It's very basic. Here it's pretending to be UPS, but that's a delivery system here in the United States, similar to DHL in Polska, or perhaps Amazon. The idea being most of us are actually expecting a package at some point, but this is very generic. Dear customer, we unable, in this case, poor English. It's trying to create a sense of urgency. So the bad guys have absolutely no idea who's going to get this. Goes to millions of people. Relatively easy to detect, but still works. How do we know? We're still seeing them. So now what would a level 2 look like? Here's a real attack we received at the SANS organization. In this case, it's pretending to be SharePoint through Office 365, letting you notice, in this case, a SANS employee, hey, you're receiving a bonus or a bonus update. So this attack is a little bit more targeted. It's going for a specific SANS employee at the SANS organization using SANS domain name. SANS happens to use Office 365. So in this case, about 10 employees received this specific attack. It's a little bit harder to detect because it looks like it's coming from within the organization. It's about technologies that we use, and it's using a sense of curiosity or too good to be true. One of those key emotional triggers we talked about. So level 2, bad guys getting better. But then there's what we consider level 3. This is far more targeted. Once again, real attack we received at the SANS Institute where I work. And the reason I have, first of all, this is a highly targeted attack. In this case, it's called BEC, Business Email Compromise. The bad guys did their research. They identified an executive at my company, Rob Lee, real executive, and they sent an email asking for a wire transfer, in this case to our accounts payable. This is the type of email that Rob may send. Bad guys did their research. What ended up happening is they identified who to figure out to pretend to be, who to send the email to, and then created this very short email. This is another trick I've learned. The more targeted the email, the more customized the attack, level 3, the shorter it tends to be. And notice there's no logos, nor are they pretending to be a specific organization. So what happens is in the most targeted attacks, it's not from an organization, it's from an individual to an individual. It looks like it's part of a normal conversation. But notice the title, urgent, using the sense of urgency. Notice if I try to reply to Rob Lee at SANS.org, I'm actually replying to some dodgy gmail.com account. That's the whole attack. Not very technical. All the bad guy did is register some random gmail.com email address and then set that as the reply to, so they can have a conversation with anyone pretending to be a SANS executive. Notice sent from my iPhone. They always have that in the signature because they don't know what Rob Lee's signature should be. So use that one. Besides, it's always easier to create a sense of urgency if it looks like you're coming from a mobile device. If I email Rob and say, Rob, can we talk real quick about this wire transfer? Rob will come back and say, oh, so sorry. I'm about to go into a meeting, get on the train. I have to catch the bus, so I can't talk on the phone. So having that signature makes it much easier to get out of any type of situation. So long story short, you have different levels of sophistication in your in your social engineering attacks. Now, same for phone calls. A phone call based social engineering attack can be just a recorded voicemail, or it can be something very targeted where the bad guys did their research. So an overall trend I'm seeing is cyber attackers are getting more sophisticated in their social engineering attacks. What happens is bad guys, before they target your company, they do some basic research. So they know what terms to use, who to target. Think about it this way. Nation state, when countries hacking country, the techniques they use tend to be more sophisticated, using things like researching their target. Cyber criminals are starting to learn from the nation state organizations and adopt those more advanced TTPs. So many ways nation state can be the leaders and the cyber criminals tend to follow. So interesting report by CrowdStrike actually showing this. This is from the CrowdStrike's 2020 Interactive Threat Report. They take something called the MITRE ATT&CK framework, which is really a cyber threat intelligence model, which is really just a breakdown of TTPs, primarily tactics and techniques. And what they did is, if you look they compared cyber criminal with nation state TTPs, and one of the number one findings is they're starting to blend. In other words, cyber criminals, especially the more advanced ones, are starting to adopt and use nation state more advanced TTPs. So from a social engineering perspective, if you see nation state doing it, at some point you can assume the more advanced cyber criminals are going to adopt it also. By the way, I am a huge fan of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. If you're not familiar with it, I really recommend checking it out. So let me give you just an example of how good and how advanced the bad guys are becoming. So this is one of my favorite stories from a SANS senior instructor. His job was is incident response for very sensitive organizations, government, defense, ransomware. Now, we all know and are familiar with ransomware. But in the old days, what would happen is if a bad guy infected a computer with ransomware, they would immediately turn it on, encrypt the computer, and then send their ransom. We want, 1 Bitcoin, half a Bitcoin, 1,000 Zloty, who knows? The whole idea is they wanted their money as fast as possible. Bad guys have advanced. The whole idea now is let's make as much money as possible. So their TTPs have advanced. Nowadays, what happens is when the bad guy gets into your network and they infect one computer, they don't turn on ransomware. In fact, we also had this recently happen last weekend in the United States. When the bad guys infect one computer, they then pivot and attempt to infect every computer in your organization and then collect lots of additional information while doing it. Now, that may take only a couple of hours, days, weeks, but what they do is they wait until they fully infect every device in your network. And then during the weekend, they flip that encryption on. They do it during the weekend because most staff are gone and there's nobody online to help stop and respond. Monday morning happens, everybody comes into work, and the entire network is down, and then you get the ransom. Far more painful and far more likely to pay. So in the case of my fellow SANS instructor, they shared the story where this happened to one organization. During the weekend, bad guys infected every device, then turned on ransomware for all of them, demanded $1 million US. The company replied, hey, you know what? We've had a really bad year financially. Revenue's way down. We can't afford this. Tell you what, we'll pay $500,000. Is that okay? Literally, the cyber criminals responded, no, actually, your financials were outstanding. Here's your financial records and profit and loss statements for the past 3 years. You've made more money than ever. You can easily afford this ransom. In fact, the price went up to $1.5 million US, and they had to pay. So the bad guys are getting much better, thinking much more strategic, and going for the big buck. In the United States, during the last weekend, we had an entire hospital network infected over the weekend. That way, the Monday morning, people come into the work and all the hospitals are down. Finally, the bad guys once again have changed their TTPs. We used to tell people, have backups. You get infected from ransomware, recover. Bad guys then adapted to our changes. Nowadays, bad guys will infect your computer with ransomware and say, pay. If you don't, they say, not a problem. We'll just take all your data and publicly expose it. Now you're in violation of GDPR, which is 4% of your revenue. So, do you prefer to pay 1% of your revenue to the bad guys for them not to release it, or pay the 4% fine if they do release it? So once again, bad guys are always adapting their TTPs to make the most, whatever it is, possible with the least effort. And I just want to emphasize that social engineering really is no different. Whoops, went back one. So one of the key things is, as this change is, what's interesting is, except for in the old days, it was all about malware. But what we're seeing is, except for ransomware, ransomware is the exception. Except for ransomware, in most social engineering cases, the bad guys are actually going for passwords. That is a big, big purpose of social engineering. Yes, we have the cyber criminals looking for money, but if it's nation state especially, but cyber criminals too, they want passwords so they can do what's called living off the land or going native. In the old days, if bad guys infected your network, they would hack one computer, pivot, and attempt to hack other computers also. Pivot, hack with lots of malware. Easy to detect. Bad guys, especially nowadays, if they get the passwords or credentials to valid accounts, they can then navigate the network looking like other normal activity, making it much, much harder to find them. So what's interesting, Microsoft Digital Defense Report, the Verizon DBIR, the recent CrowdStrike report all emphasize the key thing. Especially more advanced attackers or cyber criminals, it's passwords they're going for. And that is what we're seeing in the social engineering attacks. So what does this mean for social engineering? Especially for the level 2 and level 3 social engineering attacks, bad guys are researching their intended targets. They're using things like OSINT, LinkedIn, websites like people.com to research who they're going to attack. What's interesting is we hear stories of bad guys buying databases on the dark web to know for data on how to hack people. Why go to the dark web when you can just buy a marketing database of, all the CISOs in Poland, their names, phone numbers, email addresses, who they work for, and now you can target all the CISOs. Trust me, those marketing databases exist. Maybe you can get data by hacking one person's email account and then reading all their emails. Finally, remember, with social engineering, let's say I'm trying to hack a bank in Polska. I can simply do a phone call pretending to be the help desk. And if that phone call fails, I will have learned some things about how your organization works from that employee. Then I can pretend to be the employee I just talked to, called another employee, talk to them. Once again, if they figure it out, doesn't matter. I learn how your organization works and I get better and better. Kevin Mitnick, one of the world's most famous social engineers, wrote an entire book about that's pretty much how he hacked into Sun Microsystems and all sorts of Ericsson and other organizations by just picking up the phone, calling, learning what he could, calling somebody else in the company, learning what we could, until finally he got what he wanted. So what does this mean for social engineering in general? Expect more advanced targeted financial attacks like BEC CEO fraud, the example we showed earlier. This isn't data from the Verizon DBIR, data breach incident report, showing a huge spike, but also expect more targeted phone call based attacks. So not only more targeted email, but more targeted phone attacks. Here is a fascinating, great story by Brian Krebs on how bad guys are calling your employees who are now working from home. Talk about the perfect environment for social engineering. Calling your employees at home, pretending to be the help desk to get VPN credentials, passwords. So the bad guys can then VPN into your organization as the employee they just tricked. This is a huge growing problem with everybody working from home. So once again, we're seeing a huge rise in these social engineering attacks. But remember, basic social engineering attacks are still working also. All right, we're going to be wrapping this up. I want to cover just a couple key points of what can we do about this. Lance, social engineering we know is a problem, but I want to share some solutions. Be sure whenever you're doing any attack threat model, don't focus on just the technical attack. We need to understand social engineering is playing a growing role. And it's just not email, but phone-based attacks. Why? Simply because they work. So what can we do if we're going to be modeling these attacks and building them in our entire frameworks and how we're going to manage our risk? Train your workforce on the most common indicators of social engineering attacks. Don't teach them on every different type of attack. Don't teach them, oh, there's Twitter-based attacks and USB drops and Facebook attacks and, phone attacks and email. Turns out, doesn't matter what the modality is. Almost all social engineering attacks share the same indicators or clues. And these are probably the top 5 based on my experience. If you teach people the clues of an attack, you don't have to teach them all the different ways an attack will happen. So, for example, sense of urgency is probably the most common. They're trying to rush a victim into making a mistake, pretending to be the help desk and saying, hey, your password has to be reset. You get an email from Microsoft tech support that your computer is infected, an email from your bank. The second one is anytime a bad guy is pressuring you to bypass or ignore security policies or procedures. Curiosity, something too good to be true. The classic is, hey, here's your bonus. Click here to learn more. But once again, I'm really concerned about bad guys pretending to be somebody you know or work with. So, two big indicators. One, you get an email from your boss or a coworker, but it's not really them because you see the email is using a personal email address. It sounds so basic, but it's very effective. How many people, when they get an email from their boss, actually check the email address? If you do, you would see, at gmail.com, yahoo.com. Finally, if you get an email from somebody you know, but it just doesn't sound like them, the words they use, their tone, their voice, their signature does not sound like them. Now, will these 5 indicators detect every social engineering attack? No. Will these detect most? Yes. So if you want to teach your workforce on the basics to what to look out for, this is a good list to start with. I'm not saying you have to use this list. I'm just saying if you don't know what list to use, start with this one. Okay. Like I said, I just wanted to wrap things up and say, folks, social engineering is here to stay. In fact, we have in part caused this problem. I would suggest we have gotten so good at using technology to secure technology, we're forcing bad guys to target people like you and me. The primary way they're going to do that is social engineering. The bad guys are getting better and better. We're seeing more advanced attacks. That doesn't mean all social engineering attacks are advanced. Bad guys will continue to use the basic ones because ultimately they work. All right, I wanted to leave you with my email. Oops, just a little final quote. I forgot. One of my favorite security visionaries, Bruce Schneier, basically saying, if you just focus on technology, you're not going to solve the problem. All right, if you have any questions, would like to share more, share some information or have a story you want to share, this is my email address.